how we measure prosocial behaviors, we can do this in a lot of different ways. We can do this through laboratory tests, through naturalistic observation, and through surveys. When it comes to the laboratory tests, a common paradigm is the researcher dilemma. This is when an infant and an adult research assistant are placed in a laboratory setting, and it's in a controlled room where a camera is recording everything they do. And in a very common example of this paradigm, the researcher is attempting to reach for or obtain an object that is outside of their reach when they are sitting, but within the infant's reach. And so they're trying to see if the infant will help them in obtaining the object. So this gives the infant the opportunity to offer them instrumental aid by helping them reach their goal and obtain the object. We've also seen this paradigm used where perhaps the infant doesn't pass on the object, but perhaps the researcher is frustrated, and we try and see if the infant will offer them emotional support and consolation. And we actually do find that infants tend to offer them consolation and support, or they'll cry with them, or they'll crawl to them and comfort them. Now, there's been lots of variations done on this paradigm, and we also find that infants are more likely to help if the adult has shown that they've been harmed. If there was something, they got hurt or they were upset, the infant is actually more likely to help them. Also, if the adult had previously been generous or kind to the infant's more likely to reciprocate and help them. So at a very young age, we have a very sophisticated understanding of helping another person. These babies are more likely to help if the adult is struggling and appears to have endured harm. They're more likely to help if the adult has been kind to them. And we have seen this replicated with chimpanzees and apes in the past as well. Where we are worried about generalizing this research, of course, is to a same age peer. There's such a difference in infants and adults that this may not be a peer relation, but more of a caregiver relationship. So to look at peer relations, we tend to look at things like naturalistic observations in preschool-aged children. So this is a great example of real-world peer interactions. We simply observe on the playground same-age kids interacting with one another and observing who displays more prosocial behavior, who's inviting others to play, who's saying nice things and complimenting other kids, who's including them and not excluding them, who's helping them when they fall down and scrape their knee and comforting them. And so we can quickly assess which kids show more prosocial behaviors in an average of an hour. The problem with this is it tends to be limited to kids younger than age 4. Now, although we certainly can use naturalistic observations for kids that are elementary aged, and we find that beyond age 5, kids have different set of self-regulation skills, and they tend to be more self-conscious, so trying to do these observations in a one-time blip on the playground tends to not be possible. We tend to have to visit them time and time and time again, which is a bit more commitment and a bit more onerous on the researcher's part. Before age 5, we tend to get a pretty good snapshot in just a few visits. And so at older ages, this becomes quite time intensive. We also know this only really measures overt behavior and not internal intentions. And so in order to get at more intentions behind it, or were they really respond to other people's needs, or did it just happen to be coincidence, a lot of researchers look to surveys. And so prosocial surveys come in lots of different flavors. We have surveys directed at parents and teachers. So the parents and teachers can fill out the survey on their preschool-age children, on their elementary children, on their middle school children. And so these tend to be pretty good. However, one of the biggest drawbacks about parent and teacher rated measures is the halo effect. This is the idea that parents and teachers tend to generalize about their kid. If they think their kid is prosocial, they rate the whole survey as really high. If they think their child's not prosocial, they rate the whole survey as low. And so this becomes a bit of a problem. They don't tend to look at the individual questions, they just give them all 5s on a Likert scale or all 1s on a Likert scale. Some of the surveys that tend to do this a little bit better tend to not just have prosocial items. They'll have a mix of prosocial, anxious, aggressive items on there. So parents can't simply take the questions as dichotomous and say yes or no, or strongly agree and strongly disagree to everything. 2 of the parent and teacher rated measures I like to point out include the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire by Robert Goodman. This is a measure that you can find freely on the internet, and it's a really good measure that has lots of different subscales from not just prosocial behavior, but all kinds of other behaviors. Then we also have the Child Behavior Scale, developed in part by Gary Ladd, which also has a myriad of other types of subscales, which helps to reduce that halo effect. Now, when kids get to be mid-elementary age, they are able to complete the surveys on their own, and they're able to rate their own behavior, but they're also really good at rating peers' behavior. And we find the measure, the Extended Class Play or the Extended Class Play Revised, is a really fascinating tool. This measure has been developed and revised by many researchers, but a few that I'll name include Brett Laursen, Ken Rubin, and Linda Rose Krasner. And in this extended class play measure, students are told that everyone in their class will be taking part in a play. And there's going to be different roles to play in the play. So one role is for a child who's very loud, one role is for a child who's very quiet, one is for a leader, one is for a helper, one is for a person who is a bit more stubborn. And what they do is they kind of identify different types of child behaviors: aggressive, withdrawn, dominant, submissive, prosocial amongst them. And then the kids nominate who would fit the different roles in the play the best. And so this allows kids to determine, who are the most aggressive kids, who's best to play the bully in the play, or who's more quiet, who's going to be the whisperer in the play, and who's going to be the helper. And so the extended class play tends to be a really nice tool. It takes a little while to analyze and look at the data, but we are getting better at the data analysis for it. Now, of course, so far, these measures of prosocial would really just be looking at the more positively balanced, broad definition, so who is more socially competent. But if we want to look at that more narrow definition of prosocial behavior, there are some scales that also speak to that, including the self-report altruism scale and the prosocial tendencies measure. Now, in terms of the outcomes of prosocial behavior, it can't be underestimated. We find kids that display more positively balanced, socially competent skills. They tend to have more friends. They tend to rate their friendships as being higher in quality. They tend to be more accepted by their friends when their friends rate them. Now, these kids are not necessarily the popular or high status kids that are often sought out, but rather they're high in likability. More kids will rate them as being very likable and a good playmate, but they don't really refer to them as the cool or high status kids. In addition to peer relationships, we find kids that display more socially competent prosocial behavior will have more close relationships with their teachers. However, if they are displaying instrumental prosocial only, we find that instrumental prosociality tends to be linked with higher ratings of social aggression and more popularity rather than likability. So we can see there is that one subtype where people are really just doing things to use others for their own gain and not doing altruistically, may have a different motivation and connected to different outcomes.